Have you ever felt like someone's social media profile looks like an altar to their ego? Or have you noticed that there are profiles that don't seem to show a real life or knowledge, but rather build and display a character? If this has happened to you, it's normal. Because this is one of the main mechanisms of social media. They turn identity into a showcase, attention into a reward, and image into a strategy. We publicly manage who we want to appear to be, we show who we are, what we do, what we think, and we receive immediate feedback for it. And that's where narcissism finds its perfect ground to flourish. So today we're going to analyze how social media not only attracts narcissists, but also rewards narcissistic traits and enhances them. We're also going to look at different types of narcissism that we can detect on social media. What are the 4 narcissistic faces and which ones are most common in the digital environment? And I'm sure that with this, more than one example will come to your mind and you won't see social media the same way again. Because by the end of this video, you won't just know how to identify someone in your feed, but you'll also understand why you sometimes feel pressured to act like them yourself. I'm Claudia Nicolasa Psicologia, psychologist and author of Is It Manipulation and You Don't Know It? Subscribe to learn to analyze people and improve your relationships. Let's start by analyzing those 4 most common faces in the digital environment, which hide a strong narcissism. And for that, I want you to pay attention not so much to what they post, which is important too, but even more to why they post it. Because the content is important, but it can be created from different angles. The psychological need and the goal behind a behavior are what really interest us when it comes to analyzing. First profile, the narcissist, Grandiose, a person who doesn't just go on vacation, but posts a reel with luxury music. Getting out of a car that might be rented with a phrase like, work while they sleep. His success isn't for himself, it's so you feel like your life is small next to his. This one is the easiest to recognize, because he's also the one who most resembles that cliché, that stereotype we all might have in our heads when we think of narcissists. Someone arrogant, vain, cocky, conceited, openly self-centered. Visually, the Grandiose narcissist profile looks like an emotional resume of superiority, success, status, body, beauty, achievements, connections, travel, exclusivity. A life that seeks to prove it's above average. They don't post to share, they post to provoke admiration and even envy. Because let's remember that all narcissists, no matter what type they are, live in a world of comparison. They're always watching what others do to measure themselves. Their worth depends on how much above or below they are compared to others. That's why they're always comparing themselves. Comparing, rivaling, envying, competing, and thinking that others envy them. And in that sense, the Grandiose person's strategy is very simple. To win in that comparison, they have to be the best, the most successful, the most attractive, the one with the best life. And profile, it says look at me, envy me, aspire to this, and it's that they need to stand out and above all feel that they're not just one more. That's why when it comes to showing their life, talking about their achievements or telling stories, you'll see that they tend to exaggerate, to embellish things a lot. Everything is very epic. In all the stories, he is the main character. Everything in his life is grand, and praise is his fuel. He craves having lots of followers, receiving comments, praise, admiration, attention, even criticism. Depending on their content, they can also be a source of nourishment. Well, if their goal is to provoke envy, these will be interpreted as a sign that they are indeed superior. In fact, she will probably share these so-called envious comments, in quotes, in her stories, with a tone of, they attack me because they envy me because I am superior. Have you ever met someone who always thinks and says that people envy her? Well, pay attention. Now there will be some specific criticisms that do get to her, which are probably the ones related to that insecurity, that sense of inadequacy she might be hiding, that Achilles' heel she can't cover up, no matter how much success and image she tries to project. But be careful, because not all narcissism shines. There's one that disguises itself as a victim, so that you end up being the one who has to answer to her. Let's talk about the vulnerable narcissist, who is much harder to spot because she doesn't come in bragging, she doesn't seem the most confident, she doesn't seem the most arrogant, she doesn't fit that narcissistic stereotype we all have. In fact, she may seem like someone sensitive, hurt, misunderstood, and above all, someone who has been treated unfairly. It seems like the world has been unfair, especially to him, that he has had it harder than others, that he hasn't been as lucky as other people, that everyone has always treated him badly. He's the typical person who tells you that he's had problems with everyone. But in those stories, the bad guy is always someone else. He's always the victim and never takes any responsibility for what happens. To give a visual example, it would be that type of person who uploads a video or a story with a tone of deep disappointment, saying something like, "It's unbelievable that on this social network only empty and superficial things succeed. Me, who spends hours creating valuable content, really, who truly puts in the effort. Me, who is a great professional, it's just that people don't watch my videos." While others who have no idea or who do things badly are the ones at the top. Their post isn't a constructive criticism of the algorithm or society, but actually a cry for help. I deserve to be at the top, and the world is an unfair and inadequate place for not putting me there and putting others instead. The vulnerable narcissist uses their supposed bad luck or the harm that other creators or companies have done to them. For example, as a medal of moral superiority. In his narrative, he doesn't fail because of a lack of effort or strategy, but because he's too authentic for such a cruel and unfair world. This is an example, just so you understand how it works. And at first, when you listen to the vulnerable narcissist, without clinical criteria, your instinct is to empathize, to comfort them, to save them, to help them. But here's the trap. Don't get confused. Fragility is not the same as humility and innocence. Humility tries to go unnoticed, while narcissistic fragility wants the world to stop and pay attention to it. And the thing is, playing the victim is a card that narcissists know how to play very well. It's their perfect excuse to justify themselves, to avoid changing, to manipulate. Some narcissists use victimhood strategically at certain times, while others, like the vulnerable narcissist, use it as their calling card. And the thing is, the vulnerable narcissist, just like the others, also lives revolving around themselves. They're also egocentric, and they also live in that world of comparison, rivalry, and envy. However, instead of seeking admiration through shining, like the grandiose narcissist, they seek it through grievance, hurt, complaining, and victimization. Their logic isn't, "Look at me because I'm amazing." Their logic is, "Look at me because I'm not getting what I deserve." And the thing is, the vulnerable narcissist hides a deep inability to tolerate shame, inadequacy, failure, a profound sense of inferiority that they can't admit, which keeps them from taking chances, risking, exposing themselves, and doing all those things that would supposedly make them into the great person they claim to be. I feel so insecure that I don't dare to do it, but I justify not being there by saying I'm a victim and others don't deserve it. They try to justify themselves by saying they haven't been given as much as others, which often goes along with trying to minimize the achievements of others. If others have what I want and can't get, I conclude and express that they don't deserve it, that they haven't earned it, that they owe it to something shady. And this fits perfectly on social media, because giving opinions about other people's lives, speaking without knowing, and criticizing is easier than ever. Spending time looking for flaws and faults in others is the best way. De no mirarte a ti mismo. Not to see where you are failing. I'm sure that more than once you've come across videos or content trying to take away the credit from someone who has managed to reach a certain place. And what most characterizes this type of person is envy, resentment, and a constant need not to feel inferior. That's why vulnerable narcissistic types criticize those who actually do it, those who stand out, those who succeed, those who are where they believe they deserve to be. They can't stand seeing other people's achievements because they experience it as a threat to their own self-worth. The one who thinks that if you succeed, then you're taking it away from them, instead of thinking that everyone can succeed. They take refuge in a narrative where the problem is always outside, while in their mind, they hold on to a fantasy of being exceptional. I deserve to stand out and be seen because I have unique skills. We see that inflated ego there, but I can't tolerate risk, mistakes, or criticism because my self-esteem is very fragile and I always cling to it. So, instead of leaning toward greatness, I build a wounded identity that demands attention and special consideration. This type doesn't openly say, "I'm better than you," like, for example, the grandiose one. It says something that's more effective and also more socially accepted because we see victimhood as more positive than, for example, vanity. Their speech is like, "No one understands what I go through, I'm always treated worse, the world doesn't recognize my worth." And of course, if you notice, social media really encourages turning discomfort into content. Every frustration can become a story, every indirect comment a call for attention, every wound a way to be the center of attention on social media. You can see this in people who constantly suggest they're worse off than anyone else, who post ambiguous messages to provoke concern, who are always disappointed with others or with the world. Does that sound familiar? Have you seen it in someone? Now let's look at the antagonist narcissist. If you look at their profile, you'll notice something very interesting. There's no original idea, no project, no knowledge shared from scratch. Their content is a series of screenshots from others, or videos of criticism or development threads, riding on someone else's work. They present themselves as the supreme judge, the most moral, the one who knows the most, the one with standards no one else can reach, the one who holds the position forever, pointing out what others do wrong, but it's a trap. His so-called perfection is very secure because he never exposes himself to his own creation. He doesn't put himself out there. He simply points out, placing himself in a position of intellectual or ethical superiority just by pointing out the faults of others, as if the mere fact of seeing someone else's mistake automatically made him someone who knows more or is better. His profile. It's not a library of value, of contribution, of building. It's a courtroom where he's always the judge, but never the accused. Like the vulnerable person, he doesn't build his own value. By appearing brilliant or superior, he doesn't seek to be seen as great, successful, a winner, or with a perfect body. His way of standing out isn't by winning, but by making others lose. The grandiose one tries to show he's better, while the vulnerable one tries to show he's not the best because he's a victim. The antagonist wants to show you that others are worthless. To give you a mental picture, an antagonist is someone who corrects everyone, always criticizes, devalues, accuses, and points fingers. Their psychological fuel isn't so much the applause itself, but rather the feeling of dominance, of moral superiority. They need to confront, invalidate, ridicule, and make it clear that the other person knows less, is worth less, and thinks worse. They argue ideas, but they're not really seeking justice or trying to make the world better. They argue and point things out just to put themselves above others. That's why this type of narcissism also fits in on social media. Because unfortunately, they reward conflict, controversy, beef, public correction, humiliation, and clapbacks. And here's something important. Many times, this type of person isn't really trying to be liked by you. Yes, sometimes they might present themselves as a crusader who comes to expose mistakes or what others are doing wrong. In reality, they just want to assert themselves, provoke a reaction, and appear as the smartest and most knowledgeable. Yes, they want to be admired, but above all, they need to know that they control the situation, that they decide who is on top and who is on the bottom, that their word is the verdict of who is worthy and who is not. But of course, the antagonistic narcissist can't stand being treated the same way and reacts terribly when someone mirrors them or criticizes them. Now let's move on to the fourth type of narcissism, and the one that surprises people the most when I explain it, the communal narcissist. This is probably one of the most deceptive types, because here the ego isn't inflated through luxury or visible success, nor by playing the victim, and not by attacking either, the ego. It gets inflated through public displays of kindness. These are people who need to appear deeply committed, generous, aware, altruistic, and morally exemplary. Imagine that video of someone hugging a stranger on the street who's crying because they just gave them money, all with epic music playing in the background. They get involved, but they make sure that it's socially recorded. It's the person who records themselves giving a coin to a street artist, but makes sure the camera captures their emotional and compassionate face. Or the one who posts, "Today I decided to donate all my clothes. It feels so good to be generous." The act of kindness is real, it exists, but the goal is for you to give them their medal of moral superiority. Their question isn't if they've done something good, but how many people have seen it. They seek to feel superior by being the kindest. They need to take the position of the one who is aware, the one who rescues, the savior. That's why this type of person can seem so convincing, because on the outside they appear kind, charming, helpful, altruistic. You think, how generous, how humane. I wish there were more people like that. But when you scratch the surface a little, sometimes you discover that the real empathy isn't as deep as the moral image. There is solidarity, yes, but it's instrumentalized. Every social act becomes a spectacle. You might ask, well, Claudia, if they're focused on doing good and helping others, does it really matter? Remember that we're talking about how these people, socially and for show, are looking to feed their ego? What we're talking about in this video is only how their narcissism is expressed in one area in the public sphere. And that narcissism does the most harm in intimacy to the people who are closest to the narcissist, who are often the only ones who know their true face. Partners, family members, employees, business partners, close friends. Those people can confirm to you that the videos with thousands of views giving money to homeless people don't represent them at all. How does he treat you afterwards when there are no cameras or interest involved? In fact, when the victims of this type of narcissist come out to talk about what they've experienced, people, when they see this profile of kindness, altruism and generosity, don't believe them. What do you think? Does each type of narcissism manifest in a different way? One seeks admiration, another wants compassion and to play the victim to justify themselves. Another wants to dominate, another wants to dominate and step on others, and another wants to be seen as good and flawless. But they all share something at their core. An identity that is maintained from the outside, a great dependence on how others see them, and a deep difficulty in sustaining their own self-worth without that external supply. In addition to, of course, all the elements of narcissism, the tendency to manipulate, egocentrism, selfishness, and using and instrumentalizing people. That's scarce or sometimes non-existent empathy. But let's reflect now. Why does it seem like there are more and more narcissists? Why are social networks amplifying this? Let's analyze it carefully. Of course, social networks don't invent or create narcissists out of nowhere. It's not like you create an Instagram profile and suddenly catch the narcissism bug. But they do create the perfect ecosystem to attract narcissism. How do you feed and reinforce it? And this happens because social networks turn something very human, that need to be seen, valued, and recognized in a constant dynamic of external reward, is like an addiction. And unfortunately, nowadays, a large part of identity and social belonging are created and confirmed precisely in the digital environment. Why? Well, we spend more and more time on social media. It's where we present ourselves, where we socialize, where we create bonds socially, personally, romantically, all through social media. Does that mean that a growing part of our self-esteem, our status, our sense of self-worth is at stake in that setting? The more visibility you have, the more it seems like you are worth as a human being. Your social networks, the attention, the eyes on you, are becoming an increasingly valuable currency. Each like, each comment, each new follower, each view acts as a small dose of validation. The result is the ideal setting for them to thrive. Narcissistic ways of functioning. And this is important because we're talking about the depths of narcissistic functioning, not about being or not being a narcissist. We're talking about ways of presenting yourself, validating yourself, relating, and interacting that are operationally narcissistic. Let me explain. We all have narcissistic traits within us, narcissistic defenses that can come up in certain contexts, and that's normal. At some point, we've all needed to feel seen, validated, and recognized. At some point, we've compared ourselves to others, or we've felt insecure, or we've wanted to appear invulnerable, or we've wanted to convince others of our worth so we can feel valuable. All of these behaviors are narcissistic in nature, but that doesn't mean you're a narcissist just because they show up in you at certain times and in certain contexts. But the thing we're talking about here is that all of this can be greatly amplified by social media. Think about it. People function largely through learning. We repeat and reinforce what is rewarded, what is validated, what gives us results and pleasure. And clearly, social media brutally reinforces visibility, exaggeration, and persona. In other words, it reinforces narcissism and trains us to be more narcissistic. Naturally, this affects people differently. Depending on your structure, personality, and life, its impact will vary. But of course, if someone already had a certain amount of narcissism, then social media is the perfect fuel. How does this happen? Remember that narcissism doesn't come from solid self-esteem. It's a defense mechanism that tries to compensate for that feeling of inadequacy and insecurity by creating an inflated image, admired or protected in front of others. In other words, since I don't feel secure and valuable on the inside, I try to fill that internal void through external mechanisms. It's like a bottomless well that's constantly trying to fill itself with external water. Admiration, recognition, achievements, appearance, superiority, control, comparison. A healthy self-esteem doesn't need to constantly prove its worth. It doesn't need to be on display or have constant attention from others, nor does it fall apart because of criticism or failure. So, what happens in real life? There are imperfections. There are things we can't control. There are insecurities. There are limits. There are failures. There are things that can hurt us right in that narcissistic fragility. All of that can be filtered on social media. I often say, but nevertheless. So forgive me, but I know and will keep saying it. Social media is a place where real vulnerability is hidden, the image is controlled, and validation is quantified. They allow you to build a persona, to edit what you show, to hide what embarrasses you, to exaggerate what benefits you, to turn your identity into a showcase. It even allows you to criticize and step on others. Is that why it's the most fertile ground for this narcissistic seed? Because what's more, we are living more and more in a showcase psychology. Everything encourages you to show off, to exaggerate, to edit, and to compete for attention. And that pushes many people not to live their identity, but to design it to be consumed, like this. Social media not only attracts narcissistic personalities, it can also push normal people to adopt more and more narcissistic behaviors and traits, and therefore to hypertrophy their narcissism. In fact, many influencers admit it, being famous, having followers, receiving criticism, living constantly aware of the numbers. It has constantly changed the way they are and has brought them mental health problems. And the thing is, the more you depend on that external validation, the more fragile you become and the less free you are. Increasingly, what we do off camera feels meaningless. If it's not shared, it might as well not exist. We don't live experiences to actually live them, but to show them. We live our own lives through the eyes of strangers. And that's where digital narcissism stops being just a trait or an individual problem and becomes a social logic, a logic where seeming is more important than being, and being seen matters more than truly being alive. I want to hear you. Which of these 4 types of narcissism do you think is the most dangerous? Which one do you think is the hardest to detect?